Hello, welcome to the lecture on personality. So in this chapter, we are going to investigate a bunch of different theories that attempt to explain how it is that we as people develop our personalities. So it's probably best to start with the definition of personality, which is the unique and relatively stable ways in which people think, feel, and behave. Now, personality is not to be confused with character or temperament. Character are a series of value judgments of a person's moral and ethical behavior. So we'd say a person has good character or poor character based on our analysis of their judgments on what is morally and ethically correct. And then temperament is the enduring characteristics with which each person is born. So kind of like a baseline for the general vibe that you put out. Are you a more relaxed person or a more uptight person? And so this is different than personality, which is a much more comprehensive look at how a person thinks, feels, and behaves than either character or temperament. So there are a number of approaches to personality and understanding how we develop our personality. There are psychodynamic approaches, behaviorist, humanistic, and trait. So we are going to take a look at all of them. And to kind of get us warmed up for this lecture, let's start by getting a brief overview on personality theories.
What do you see in this image? A scary face, a couple of squirrels fighting? Or this one, a squashed frog, or tumbling poodles, a bleeding bat? Herman Rorschach wants to know. He wanted to know. He's dead now. He believed that your answers, what you saw in the ink, said something about your personality. Rorschach was a Swiss psychoanalyst who in his youth was fascinated by the childhood game of making pictures out of ink blots, called klexography. As an adult, Rorschach was intrigued with Carl Jung's use of word association in attempts to access patients' unconscious minds. Jung would ask patients to say the first thing that came to mind when they saw words like dead or window or abuse, and Rorschach thought, why not do the same thing with amorphous blobs? So he'd show a patient a series of ink blots and record what they saw to determine how people projected their personal associations onto random shapes. Assuming there were important differences between those who saw dancing bunnies versus those who saw severed screaming heads, he drew conclusions about a patient's personality. And yeah, this was controversial. Some clinicians still do think that the Rorschach test can be a helpful diagnostic tool when used correctly and cautiously, but others remain critical of the test, calling them unscientific and unreliable. It's even been called the Dracula of psychological tests because no one has been able to drive a stake through its heart yet. So I guess this is the part where I apologize for the set design. Sorry. But love it or hate it, the Rorschach test is one of the many methods psychologists have used in an ongoing quest to understand personality. And of all the concepts we cover in this course, personality is one of the most complex and one of the most contested. This is where we bring in the household names, not just Rorschach, but Freud and Jung, as well as other influential thinkers like Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers. It's where some of the most familiar concepts in early psychology come into play, ones that people with even passing knowledge of the field have heard of. The ego, the Oedipus complex, penis envy, inferiority complexes, even the idea of self-help itself. Whether you've heard of these things as hard facts or simply historical curiosities, these notions represent the starting points for some of the biggest and most compelling questions in the field, but they all come back to the same question. What makes us who we are? We always gotta start out with defining things. Personality, you think you know what that means, but we're gonna define it as your distinctive and enduring characteristic patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving. And psychologists typically study personality in two broad ways. One, by trying to understand differences in specific characteristics, like introvertedness versus extrovertedness, and two, by looking at how all the various parts of each person mesh together as a whole. Basically, what are our characteristics and how do they combine to make me, me, and you. And guess what? As you might expect, there are a number of competing perspectives on personality theory. 4, to be exact. The first, and one of the most influential, has been the psychoanalytic perspective, first championed by our coke-loving, cigar-chewing friend Sigmund Freud. It was through his clinical observation of patients that Freud came to theorize the existence of the unconscious. For Freud, the unconscious represented a vast reservoir of often unacceptable and frequently hard-to-tolerate thoughts, feelings, desires, and memories, usually involving lots of weird sex stuff. Gotta point out, by the way, that the Freudian unconscious is a different thing from the contemporary idea of non-conscious information processing, when we're like processing information that we don't know we're processing. Freud's thing is, a lot more titillating, but the non-conscious is, like, empirically validated, a real thing that we study now. Anyway, Freud believed that our personalities are largely shaped by the enduring conflict between our impulses to do whatever we feel like and our restraint to control those urges, between our pleasure-seeking aggressive urges and our inner social control over them. He theorized our minds as being divided into 3 interacting parts: the id, the ego, and the superego, that provide the battleground for this internal conflict that shaped our personalities. You can think of the classic Freudian mind like this iceberg. It's mostly hidden, and that big underwater chunk is your id, your unconscious, primitive, and instinctive self. Freud thought the id was all about sex and aggression, the so-called pleasure principle of immediate gratification. To him, infants were all id. That's in part why babies freak out when they don't get a snack like right now, instead of just taking a deep breath for a second. For that matter, a lot of the off-the-wall celebrities and dictators are big ids. The id's like a honey badger. They don't care. Eventually, kids develop the ego part of their personality, that largely conscious component that's charged with dealing with reality. The ego works on getting the id what it wants in a reasonable, timely, and realistic way without, getting arrested or beaten up. The final aspect to form in Freud's personality trifecta is the superego, the Jiminy Cricket voice of our conscience that represents not just the real, but also the ideal. As you can imagine, the superego and the id don't much like each other, and it's up to the referee ego to sort everything out. And it's hard to be the ego. Freud believed that anxiety comes in part from the ego getting all stressed out about losing control over the id and superego. So he proposed that our egos use a series of indirect and unconscious defense mechanisms to protect themselves from this fear. And each person's particular configuration of defense mechanisms in turn makes up part of what we're referring to here as personality. You might already have heard of repression, the defense that's thought to work by banishing any thoughts, feelings, or memories that cause anxiety to the unconscious. And repression, Freud thought, allows our many other defense mechanisms to do their work. Regression, for example, involves a retreat to a more infantile psychosexual stage, like when a second grader sucks their thumb when they're nervous. Reaction formation is kind of like passive aggression. It involves flipping unacceptable impulses, like the desire to punch someone in the face, with their opposites, like offering them cookies with a fake smile. Projection is when you disguise your own impulses by calling them out in other people, and rationalization is just what it sounds like, when we offer explanations and excuses for our behaviors instead of getting to the real unconscious reasons. Like, yeah, well, I ate 6 Hot Pockets at the party just because I was being social. Displacement is the typical you got yelled at by your boss and then came home and yelled at your roommate. It's when you shift your impulses toward a less threatening victim. And then there's denial, which is when you refuse to believe or sometimes even perceive some kind of painful reality, like, oh, boyfriend isn't cheating on me, and I'm not gonna fail that class, and these pants totally still fit. Our defense mechanisms, as theorized by Freud, are pretty tied in with our personalities. Someone who engages in a lot of denial and not as much projection would probably look and act a lot differently from someone who chronically does the reverse. Still, Freud was convinced our personalities form in our first few years as we pass through a series of 5 psychosexual stages, essentially during which the id seeks to get its rocks off in different pleasure-sensitive areas. Infants start out in the oral stage because they get pleasure from eating. From there, a child enters the anal stage, focused on peeing and pooping, then on to the phallic stage as they discover their boy and girl bits. It was during this stage that Freud believed the infamous Oedipus complex reared up, characterized by a boy experiencing a form of sexual desire toward his mother and a parallel jealousy or hatred of his father. Freud called from about age 6 to puberty the latency stage, marked by dormant sexual feelings, which eventually evolved into the 5th and final adult genital stage of mature sexual interests. Now, he believed if certain conflicts weren't resolved at any of these given stages, a person could develop a fixation, or a lingering focus on a younger stage. Like if a baby was overfed or neglected and underfed, they might fixate in the oral stage. An orally fixated adult might seek oral gratification through excessive eating or chain smoking, and may develop issues with dependency or aggression. Now, of course, not everyone was on board with Freud's model of personality development. Many of his ideas were controversial, and remain so to this day. Even most modern psychoanalysts now dispute the whole Oedipal thing. In fact, fact, while many pioneering psychoanalysts built on Freud's theories, these are so-called Neo-Freudians, many disagree with lots of his ideas and instead either emphasize the role of the conscious mind or focus on non-sexual motivations. Take Karen Horney, for instance, a German-born psychoanalyst credited with founding feminist psychology. She wasn't down with the idea that our personalities are primarily shaped by sex and aggression. She especially rejected the notion of penis envy, which she thought was more than a little insulting to women. She actually proposed that womb envy may occur as much in men who are envious they can't give birth. She encouraged patients to take charge of their own mental health and engage in self-help and analysis, believing people were often able to sort of be their own therapists. We mentioned Carl Jung, the famous Swiss psychoanalyst. Jung was a friend and disciple of Freud, but eventually theoretical differences took them in different directions. He agreed that the unconscious was a powerful force, but he believed it was more than just a holding cell for repressed sexual thoughts and feelings and memories. Jung believed sexual drive was only part of the equation, and that we're also driven by a need to achieve a full knowledge of self. He also suggested that we have a collective unconscious, a group of shared images or archetypes that are universal to all humans, and this was why different cultures share similar myths and imagery. Vienna-born Alfred Adler was another former collaborator of Freud who struck out on his own. Adler agreed with Freud that childhood was important, but he emphasized ongoing social tensions, not sexual ones, as most crucial to the formation of personality. He coined the term inferiority complex and believed that much of our adult behavior is linked to childhood struggles with feeling inferior. In the end, not all of their theories have endured, but Freud and his contemporaries were key to the evolution of psychoanalytic theory because they explored ways in which our mental life and personality may be submerged beneath the veil of consciousness. But the psychoanalytical approach is only one perspective on what makes us who we are. Rather than focusing on how messed up we can be, humanistic theorists focus on the basic goodness of people and how they strive to achieve their full potential. In other words, they believe in the potential for personal growth. Abraham Maslow is one of these guys. He believed we're motivated by that pyramid-shaped hierarchy of needs, and that once basic needs are met, like food and shelter and whatnot, we're able to achieve higher goals. Maslow believed the top two rungs of that pyramid are where the real growth in personality takes place. First, with self-actualization, or the need to live up to our full unique potential, and then with self-transcendence, or finding meaning and purpose and identity beyond ourselves. Rather than study only troubled patients, Maslow looked at healthy, creative types with whom he discovered this common thread of self-actualization. Bolstered by a secure sense of self, these people were more sure of themselves, more compassionate, caring, driven, and uneasy around cruelty and pettiness. American psychologist Carl Rogers was another pioneer of humanistic theory who proposed a person-centered perspective on personality. Like Maslow, Rogers believed we're all basically good eggs so long as we're nurtured in a growth-promoting environment that he thought required three conditions. The first is genuineness, just the idea that parents and teachers should be transparent and open with their feelings. Then there's acceptance. When folks are accepting, people around them won't be afraid to be themselves or make mistakes. And the third requirement, according to Rogers, is empathy, or the ability to share others' feelings and reflect their meanings. Rogers thought of these traits as the nutrients required to make a personality grow into a healthy self-concept, that mix of thoughts and feelings that answer the fundamental question, who am I? So psychoanalytic and humanistic theories of personality were and are incredibly influential, even if one was a little sordid and the other a little sunshine and rainbows. But they didn't always lend themselves to clear measurement, and as empirical standards began to take hold in the mid-20th century, this became a major concern. How did we deal with that? Well, tune in next week when we explore some of the newer ways of looking at personality and how we started measuring it. Today, you learned about personality theory and two of its early schools of thought, the psychoanalytic theory, including Freud's three-part model of the mind and defense mechanisms, along with the Neo-Freudians. You also learned about the humanistic theory, including Maslow's model of self-actualization and Rogers' person-centered perspective. Thanks for watching this episode of Crash Course, especially to all of our Subbable subscribers who make Crash Course possible for all people to love and enjoy for free. To find out how you can become a supporter, just go to subbable.com/crashcourse. This episode was written by Kathleen Yale and edited by Blake T. Bastino, and our consultant is Dr. Ranjit Bhagwat. Our director and editor is Nicholas Jenkins, the script supervisor is Michael Aranda, who is also our sound designer, and the graphics team is Thought Cafe.
Okay, so the first approach to understanding how we develop our personalities that we're going to take a look at is the psychodynamic approach, which you know by now is associated with Sigmund Freud. So he was the developer of the approach. So the psychodynamic approach to personality says that our personality is motivated by inner forces and conflicts about which we have very little awareness, if any at all. And we have very little control over these inner forces. So the kind of take home from this is that we have these unconscious forces that act as determinants of our personality, or that ultimately make up our personality. So Freud's theory is controversial, and some might even say shocking. So before we kind of dive into it, let's go ahead and watch a brief documentary on Freud to get a better feel and understanding for where he was coming from. And then we'll take a look at his interesting ideas on personality.
Of all the great figures in psychology, perhaps Sigmund Freud is the most important.
We all speak Freud. Every time we turn around and say, oh, he's so anal, or that person is a control freak, or talk about Freudian slips, or even speculate about the meaning of our dreams.
He was an intellectual, he was an eccentric. At times he was an abuser of substances.
I think history has been complex in its relation to Sigmund Freud. He's both valued and devalued. He's idealized and he's denigrated.
In 1938, during the last year of his life, Sigmund Freud was old and sick, but his mind was still sharp.
I discovered some important new facts about the unconscious. Out of these findings grew a new science, psychoanalysis.
And with psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud opened the doors to the unconscious, forever changing the way we view the human mind. The late 1800s marked the end of the Victorian Age, a period of extreme puritanical restrictions. Any expression of human sexuality was considered an outrage. Respectable women only went to their doctors with a chaperone. Personal matters were never discussed in polite society. Professional therapists didn't exist, and people with psychological problems had nowhere to go. Mental patients were treated like outcasts. They were put in asylums and received antiquated, and in some cases, even barbaric care. Treatments included alternating hot and cold baths, lengthy periods of drug-induced sleep, and in some cases, brain surgery that resulted in death. It was in the midst of this, in 1886, Dr. Sigmund Freud began treating patients with a simple but radical approach. He listened.
Physicians of that day prescribed, but they didn't listen. They were the authorities. The patient was expected to, in effect, obey and listen to the doctor. Listening to a patient's life history was an entirely new development.
Freud's goal was to get his patients to talk as much as possible about anything and everything. In Freud's office, no subject was taboo. But rather than interview them face to face, he had his patients lie on a couch turned away from him, so that they would be more comfortable revealing their deepest thoughts. If his methods seemed peculiar, the theories behind them were even more outlandish. Sigmund Freud developed a revolutionary new way of thinking about the human mind. He introduced the idea of the unconscious. Freud believed that the unconscious is a place where we bury conflicts such as painful memories or unacceptable thoughts that we do not want to deal with. And this can make conscious life more difficult.
He said the unconscious is the real us, buried down like the bottom of an iceberg. All we see is the tip of the iceberg above the surface of the ocean. That's the present day us. But what really makes us is the downstairs, the subconscious. We are driven by sexual desires, for example, that lay dormant but are trying to somehow affect our behavior.
Freud was convinced that if his patients could bring their repressed thoughts to the surface through conversation, they would have to confront them. This alone could diminish their anxieties and eventually relieve them of their symptoms.
This central Freudian notion of the unconscious mind is the one that everyone has to deal with, whether they accept it or reject it. They cannot ignore it. There aren't that many ideas within the history of ideas that have that kind of galvanizing power.
At first, the mainstream medical community met Freud with scorn and derision. They labeled him a radical and revolutionary, a description that suited him even as a child. Sigmund Freud grew up in a poor Jewish neighborhood in Vienna. As a boy, Sigmund was a brilliant, ambitious, and opinionated student.
At school, I was always the bold oppositionist, always on hand when an extreme had to be defended.
One could say that, in a certain sense, as we look at Freud's accomplishments, that he was already at a very young age in a class by himself.
At 17, Freud graduated high school and entered the University of Vienna to study medicine.
Medicine was a good way for a young Jewish boy who was very bright to make a career for himself. But Freud also clearly had a great deal of scientific curiosity. He always had, from his youth, this kind of questing. He would put himself a problem and then just go after it until he solved it.
In 1882, Freud began an internship at the General Hospital in Vienna, and for the next 3 years, he experimented with a number of different specialties, including neurology. Freud was consumed by his research, but the 26-year-old was also in love. It was during his internship that Freud met Martha Bernays, a lively, intelligent woman. Martha came from a good Austrian family.
This was his great love, and he struggled to win her and to get together enough money to be able to marry her, and it's over several years that this unfolds.
Only one thing stood in their way. Sigmund Freud was unknown. He would have to make a name for himself first. Freud redoubled his efforts at the hospital. He dreamt of making a discovery that would make him famous, wealthy, and benefit mankind. He soon pinned his hopes for fame and fortune on a little-known drug, which seemed to hold great promise as an anesthetic and as a treatment for exhaustion and depression. It was cocaine. Freud believed in cocaine so much that he began using the drug himself, and even sent some to Martha. Freud said cocaine helped him relax in social situations and made him feel more like a man.
You perceive an increase in self-control, more vitality and more capacity for work. This result is enjoyed without any of the unpleasant aftermaths which accompany exhilaration from alcoholic means.
Anxious to capitalize on his discovery, Freud published a paper extolling the drug's virtues. But Freud deeply regretted his haste after the drug's addictive properties became known. It was a huge blow for Freud professionally.
It was a source of great disappointment for Freud because he had hoped to be the discoverer of local anesthesia, cocaine being first used effectively as a local anesthetic. It's possible that Freud even thought it had certain aphrodisiac qualities.
In 1885, Freud's career took a momentous turn for the better. That year, his research in neurology led him to Paris to study the problem of hysteria with Dr. Jean-Marie Charcot. Hysteria had become a catch-all diagnosis for patients who exhibited an array of physical symptoms like spastic tics and speech impairments with no known medical cause. Hysteria was widely believed to be incurable, but Charcot disagreed.
Charcot felt that hysteria was not necessarily degenerative, that it was possible to think in terms of cure, and that it was a condition of psychological origin. And this is the beginning for Freud. Freud's year with Charcot was really a turning point for him.
The experience of Charcot was very significant for the impression it made on Freud. People under hypnosis could become aware of thoughts, feelings, fantasies, issues that they were not consciously aware of. So it gave Freud a beginning feeling for the unconscious mind.
Determined to explore this further, Freud went to work with Joseph Breuer, a prominent Viennese physiologist who was also researching hysteria. Breuer had been treating a patient named Anna O with a revolutionary new therapy, the talking treatment.
Breuer learned that bringing Anna O back to earlier experiences which were disturbing to her and having her relive them and talk about them, talk them out, she symptomatically made extraordinary improvements in her condition. And it was Anna O herself, the patient, who coined the term the talking treatment.
The work of Charcot and Breuer intrigued Freud. In 1886, he opened his own practice, dedicated to treating hysteria and other nervous diseases. However, Freud's practice wasn't an immediate success. He experimented with a variety of techniques, including electrotherapy and hypnosis, but his results were disappointing.
He discovered by putting a person under a hypnotic spell that you can get them to remember things that they have forgotten, to make associations between memories that had not been clear to them, and you can produce a temporary alleviation of symptoms, but it didn't last. And I had the further difficulty that it was difficult to make a determination between a person's memory and something that might be suggested by the hypnotist. And Freud became very cautious about suggestibility.
Determined to avoid suggestion, ultimately Freud abandoned hypnotism, and he developed a new technique based on Joseph Breuer's talking treatment called free association. For Freud, free association meant encouraging his patients to speak freely, with as little censorship or guidance as possible. This process not only seemed to make Freud's patients feel better, but more importantly, over time, his patients' ramblings revealed to Freud their underlying conflicts.
If patients like Anna O were allowed and encouraged to speak freely, inevitably the disturbing experiences that they brought up connected with their symptoms began to go back to adolescence and childhood.
One such case was known as the burnt pudding case. It involved a woman who, as a child, had been abused by her father. Coincidentally, there was a smell of burnt pudding coming from the kitchen at the time.
Years later, she was a nanny working for a family, and the father was again an abusive man. One day during one of these abusive episodes, not directed at her, the cook was burning the pudding. And the combination of the intense emotional experience triggered by the recurrence of the smell brought on a hysterical symptom.
As more and more of Freud's patients began recalling incidences of abuse from their childhood, Freud arrived at a bold conclusion that he would later come to regret. All hysteria was caused by sexual abuse during childhood. And Freud even went further, theorizing that unconscious sexual urges begin in infancy and drive much of human behavior. None of this sat well in Victorian Vienna.
The Times certainly did not favor any unedited, unexpurgated discussion of sex. That much we can say automatically. And certainly the public in Vienna, back in that time, didn't want to deal with issues of sexual molestation any more than they really wanted to acknowledge all kinds of other problems inside and outside of homes.
Despite his unconventional theories, Freud's own home life was traditional. Having married the love of his life, Martha Bernays, the Freuds had 6 children during their first 9 years of marriage. They settled into a typical domestic arrangement. While Martha managed the family, Sigmund Freud was consumed by his work.
Freud not only saw patients 5 and 6 days a week, but some of the patients went with him on his vacations and continued their analytic work there.
I cannot imagine life without work as really comfortable. I find amusement in nothing else.
Freud's analytic work didn't stop with his patients. When his father died in 1896, Freud's grief moved him to begin a process of self-analysis. In effect, Dr. Sigmund Freud became his own patient.
He was his own best subject. He realized the benefit of releasing some of these subconscious issues of his own, and that felt that it was important for each individual psychologist to have worked these issues through on their own to be able to better treat the patient.
In his efforts to better access his unconscious mind, Freud discovered a whole new road to the unconscious, the dream. Over time, he theorized that dreams were a place where the mind runs uncensored, playing out thoughts and memories we dare not discuss in the waking world. Freud believed that dreams could provide him with remarkable access to the repressed thoughts in his own mind, as well as his patients.
Dreams were viewed two different ways before Freud. They were of fantastic importance, prophecies about the future. They were almost divine messages. They were also considered to be nonsense, just waste products of the sleeping mind. Now, what Freud did was to elevate dreams into the realm of scientific observation and discovery. He showed that dreams had a meaning.
Freud presented his ideas on dreams to the world in 1899 in one of his most controversial books. He called it simply The Interpretation of Dreams.
When Freud published The Interpretation of Dreams, it sold less than 100 copies initially. I mean, it was a book that had initially no resound in the world.
Reviews of The Interpretation of Dreams were few and unflattering, and Freud's theories were condemned as repugnant.
Freudianism is digging down into the sewage of our moods and appetites, dreams and passions.
Dr. Freud lives in the fairyland of dreams among the ogres of perverted sex.
His theories lend themselves with terrible ease to the uses of ignorance and quackery.
These theories were frightening to a great many people. They certainly challenged the establishment. I think it would be an exaggeration to say that people thought he was insane, although I'm sure there were some who did.
Dogged by resistance to change, Freud faced an uphill battle.
There followed a period of absolute helplessness. At that time, I would gladly have dropped the whole thing. Perhaps I persevered only because I had no longer any choice of beginning something else.
But Freud had confidence in his work, and he remained committed to his theories. In the early 1900s, a small number of like-minded men became interested in Freud's new science, psychoanalysis. At first, the group met in Freud's apartment to hear him lecture and discuss his theories. As Freud's reputation grew, so did his circle of supporters. And in time, psychoanalytic societies sprang up in Vienna, Zurich, and New York. Over the next 20 years, Freud published more than a dozen books and wrote volumes of letters, papers, and articles. Though he did revise his theory that all hysteria was caused by sexual abuse, Freud continued to provoke the mainstream. He developed new theories on everything from the components of the mind to childhood sexuality. Soon, terms like ego, superego, the id, and the Freudian slip all became household words. But just as Freud's ideas began to take hold, Freud became ill. In 1923, as a result of a lifelong addiction to cigars, Freud was diagnosed with mouth cancer. He battled the disease for the next 16 years and endured dozens of painful operations in the process. Over time, both his speech and hearing became permanently affected.
He had a whole side of his face, his jaw, replaced with a prosthesis. Painful to wear, painful to take out, painful to put back in. Just a horrible illness.
In the midst of Freud's battle with cancer, an even greater battle was spreading throughout Europe. In the 1930s, the Nazis began their rise to power, and in 1938, Sigmund Freud looked on with horror as the Germans occupied Austria. The Nazis condemned Freud's psychoanalytic theories as Jewish pornography, and they burned his books.
What progress we are making. In the Middle Ages, she would have burnt me. Nowadays, they are content with burning my books.
Fearing for his safety, Freud's friends and supporters, both in the United States and England, began urging him to flee Vienna, but Freud was reluctant to leave.
This is where he had grown up, this is where he had his education, this was where he had so many attachments. It was really a part of his identity and part of his life.
It wasn't until the Gestapo arrested his daughter Anna for questioning that Freud realized that he and his family could no longer safely remain in Austria. And in June of 1938, Freud left Vienna for London. Freud spent the last year of his life very ill, but surrounded by friends, family, and supporters. He died in exile in 1939. More than 60 years after his death, the pioneering work of Sigmund Freud is being carried on by thousands of psychoanalysts around the world. And what began as an effort to treat the mentally ill is today helping people from all walks of life.
There's an openness in society today that can be traced directly back to some of the Freudian thought and theory and how things have shifted. We are a society that talks very freely about our inner feelings, about our conflicts, about sex, sexuality. This is all part of the Freudian revolution.
Okay, so let's take a look at some of Freud's very controversial ideas on how we determine our personality. And to understand his theories, we have to start with the idea that the mind is divided into three parts, at least according to Freud. So he said the three parts are the conscious, the preconscious, and the unconscious mind. And he very famously has this iceberg analogy to help us understand the relationship between the parts of the mind and what's available to us, what's not, what others can see, what others can't. So we'll begin with the preconscious, and this is the level of the mind that contains memories, information, and events that we can easily become aware of. So recent memories, dreams that we've recently had, recent experiences, things that are not currently on our mind, but we could just kind of reach right below the surface of the water and access those thoughts or ideas if we wanted to. The next part of the mind we're going to discuss is the conscious level of the mind, and this is the area of the mind that holds our current awareness, what we're thinking of right now. So this is the part of the mind that is available to us very easily. It's what is going on right now inside of our minds. And then the part of the mind that Freud was most interested in, and as you can see by the iceberg analogy, the part of the mind that he thought was the biggest, so contained the most stuff, is the unconscious mind. And this is the level of the mind in which our thoughts, our feelings, our memories, and other information is kept and is not easily or voluntarily brought into consciousness. So Freud says that the unconscious remains hidden at all times. It surfaces only in symbolic form, usually in dreams or in behaviors that people engage in without knowing why they have done so, which he famously called a Freudian slip. And according to Freud, the unconscious mind holds the things that we keep from our conscious mind because these things are threatening to our ego. So we don't want to deal with them, we don't want to face them, so we push them down into our unconscious. And so the unconscious acts like a safe haven for our real thoughts and emotions. So the unconscious mind holds way more information than the conscious mind. And even if we tried to pull the information from our unconscious, when it comes into our conscious mind, it will come in a different or disguised form, in a symbolic form, because our conscious mind perceives this information as that threatening that it can't face it head on, so it has to see it as a disguise or in a symbolic form. So Freud says to understand our personality, we must look at the unconscious because that's where the real us is. And to look at your unconscious, you would have to analyze your slips of the tongue, look at your fantasies or your dreams, kind of when your mind goes into autopilot, where does it go? And that might help you to kind of start to dive into or crack the door open to your unconscious mind. So Freud believed that the personality was divided into three parts: the id, the ego, and the superego. And if you wanted to kind of map out those parts of the personality in conjunction with the parts of the mind, you could take another iceberg picture, and if it was a transparency, you could lie it on top of the iceberg picture representing the mind, and you would be able to see which parts of the personality are associated with which parts of the mind. Okay, so the first part of the personality that we're going to talk about is the part that takes up the most space in our unconscious. It's the id, spelled ID. So the id is kind of has the sole purpose to satisfy these primitive instinctual cravings. You could consider the id to be amoral. It contains all of our animalistic drives, our biological needs, hunger, thirst, sex. And it's the part of the personality that's present at birth, and like I said, it's completely unconscious. So Freud said that the id operates on what's known as the pleasure principle. And so the pleasure principle is the immediate satisfaction of needs without regard for the consequences. So the id is like a baby in that it's demanding, it's illogical, it's irrational, and it's impulsive. It wants what it wants when it wants it, and it's not at all concerned with the consequences. The next part of the personality is the superego, and this is the part of the personality that acts as a moral center, or your Jiminy Cricket. It is where your conscience is, so it's the part of the personality that produces pride or guilt, depending on how acceptable it deems your behavior to be. And it really represents the rights and wrongs of society as handed down by your parents, by teachers, by other important figures. So it's that little voice in the back of your head that's kind of judging all your behavior to determine if it's morally up to the standards that have been put in you by important figures in your life. And then there is the ego, and the ego balances the id and the superego. It operates on what Freud called the reality principle, and this is the principle by which the satisfaction of the demands of the id are met, but only when negative consequences will not result. So the ego really provides a buffer between the id and the outside world, and what is socially acceptable and what is not. And the ego, Freud said, is logical, rational, and cunning. It's the part of the personality that develops out of a need to deal with reality. So the ego then is really how we see ourselves, the person that we think we are, the person that we want to show to the world, the way that we want to be perceived is our ego. So Freud said that all three parts of the personality work together, but the ego is really the executive director. And independently, the superego and the id are unrealistic. If we just were all superego, this would create perfect robots that are unable to adapt or compromise to life or take risks. And if we were all id, this would just create pleasure-seeking, thoughtless, reckless people. So if you've ever seen a picture of a person with an angel on their shoulder and a devil on the other side, this is actually a perfect metaphor for the three parts of the personality, where the ego is represented by the person, and then the devil is the id, and the angel is the superego. Okay, so all of this talk that we've been doing about the parts of the mind and the parts of the personality according to Freud, have just really been setting us up to discuss his theory on how we develop our personality. And so his theory is centered around what is called the psychosexual stages. And Freud proposes that there are 5 stages of personality development, and each of the stages are tied to the sexual development of the child. So each stage occurs at a certain age range in the person's life, and there is a focus of libido or sexual center that the child is interested in at each stage. And at each stage, there is a conflict that the child should overcome in order to develop, quote unquote, normally, according to Freud. So if a person does not successfully resolve the conflict at any given stage, then they become fixated in that stage. So according to Freud, a failure to successfully pass through or resolve conflicts at each stage is what results in these fixations. And so a person becomes kind of stuck in a stage or fixated in a stage if their needs have been ignored or overindulged. So these fixations can result in personality traits and behaviors that are associated with that stage that they're kind of fixated or stuck in. So the first stage is the oral stage, and this stage usually occurs between birth and anywhere from 12 to 18 months. The infant's center of pleasure is their mouth. So you'll notice that a lot of children are constantly putting things in their mouth, toys, pacifiers, just anything they can get their hands on. And Freud said that the major developmental crisis or goal here is to successfully wean the child off of breastfeeding. And so in order to do that, the child needs to be fed an appropriate amount of time and appropriate length of time. So if the child is overfed or underfed or fed too long or not fed long enough, then it's possible that they can develop a oral fixation or become fixated in the oral stage. And a person who is fixated in the oral stage will have a oral fixation as an adult in which they will be likely to overeat, talk a lot, smoke cigarettes, bite their nails, chew on pens. And Freud even said that they are more likely to have a bitingly sarcastic sense of humor or be willing to swallow anything, in other words, meaning they're gullible. The next stage is the anal stage, and this is when the child is between the ages of 12 and 18 months and continues on till around 3 years. And so the anal stage is when the child's pleasure center is on their anus. And so at this time, their major conflict is about toilet training. So if they are not successful in toilet training, then they become anally fixated. And there's 2 results of anal fixation. There's the anal expulsive personality and the anal retentive personality. So the latter is a lot more popular than the former, but the anal expulsive personality is a person that's fixated in the anal stage who is messy, destructive, hostile, loud, demanding. And then the anal retentive personality is a person fixated in the anal stage who is neat, fussy, stingy, stubborn, organized. And so the reason for these outcomes, according to Freud, is that when a child is in the anal stage, they're sort of obsessed with what their anus can do, particularly as it relates to defecating or going poop. And so when they are toilet trained and they're being overindulged, meaning they're being pushed a lot do you have to go to the bathroom? Do you have to go to the bathroom? Come on, let's go to the bathroom. Then this can be overwhelming and overbearing, and the child kind of thinks to themselves like, hey, this is my anus that I'm real into right now. I'm in charge of this thing. I'm going to decide when I'm going to go to the bathroom. And so their way of handling this is to hold in their feces, refuse to go. And this is what Freud says creates that anal retentive, uptight person who's neat and organized and fussy and stingy. And then a child who is not able to kind of show off the wonders of their anus because their parents aren't paying attention to them during toilet training. So it's kind of like they're going to the bathroom and the potty and no one cares, no one's paying attention. What you might see this child do is spread their feces around, defecate in areas where in the house where they shouldn't be, leave their feces in the toilet so that someone could see it. They're sort of starved for attention because they're so proud of their anus, but yet no one seems to be caring or paying attention. And so Freud said that that's what creates that anal expulsive personality, the person who's messy, destructive, hostile, demanding, needs attention, like look at me, look at me, look at me, because they were sort of starved of that attention when they were toilet training and were just astounded by all the magic that they could do with their anus, and nobody cared. All right, and then the next stage, which is probably the most well-known stage of his psychosexual stages theory and is the most controversial and talked about, is the phallic stage. So the phallic stage, according to Freud, extends from 3 years to anywhere between 5 and 6 years old, and this is when the child's pleasure center is on their genitals. And so what Freud says is that the major conflict for males is called the Oedipus complex, and it's based off of Greek mythology, specifically a story of a man named Oedipus Rex who unknowingly killed his father, married his mother, and upon learning that his mother was his wife, stabbed his own eyes out. So the Oedipus complex, according to Freud, is the idea that all little boys in the phallic stage have this unconscious sexual attraction or desire for their mother. However, they are afraid that their father is going to figure out that they are attracted to their mother and in retaliation castrate them or cut off their penis. This creates what is known as castration anxiety, according to Freud. It's also been described in a more figurative sense in which the fear of castration or castration anxiety is more the idea that you're repressing the strong desire towards your mother and therefore repressing your own masculinity, and this emasculation is what constitutes the feelings of castration or castration anxiety. At any rate, it is this castration anxiety, according to Freud, that leads the child to successfully resolve the Oedipus complex in the phallic stage, because according to Freud, the child kind of makes this plan to prevent dad from finding out about his attraction towards mom, where he is going to become best friends with dad and kind of throw him off, and so the dad has no idea that he's attracted to mom. But through this plan, what happens accidentally is the son starts to realize that he has a lot in common with dad, and dad's pretty cool, and he decides that mom is dad's, and dad can keep mom, and he'll search for another woman when he's of age. And so this process of understanding that dad is cool and that he likes dad and they have a lot in common is called identification. So identification is really the key to resolving the Oedipus complex, according to Freud. And the female equivalent of the Oedipus complex is the Electra complex. So this is the crisis that they have to resolve in the phallic stage. And it's based on the Greek mythology story of Electra, who plotted with her brother to kill her mother and stepfather in revenge for them killing Electra's father. So according to Freud, the Electra complex is every little girl's unconscious wish for their father, a sexual attraction towards their father. And basically the way that the Electra complex gets resolved is a female child realizes that she does not have a penis through playing a game of I'll show you mine if you show me yours with another kid, or seeing her brother's penis in the bathtub, or playing doctor or whatever. She realizes that she doesn't have a penis, and she concludes that her mother must have found out that she has this attraction towards her father and cut off her penis. And so she becomes angry and resentful towards her mother because of this perceived castration. And at this point, she also develops what Freud called penis envy, which is the desire to get the penis back or to have the penis, which really fuels the attraction towards their father even more, because they want their father's penis, according to Freud. And so, in the same way, the little boy devises a plan to throw dad off about his attraction towards mom, the little girl devises a plan to throw dad or mom off by teaming up with mom and hanging out with mom a lot. And then, accidentally, through that process, she realizes that mom's pretty cool. She actually likes mom. They have a lot in common, and identification occurs. And this is what resolves the Electra complex. So Freud said that one telltale sign of a man fixated in the phallic stage because they never resolved the Oedipus complex is a mama's boy. So the idea is that they still have this attraction towards their mom and they're unconscious and they're not aware of it, and it's being kind of manifested into this really close, almost abnormal relationship with their mom as an adult. And then for women that are fixated in this stage and never resolved the Electra complex, you might see these women marrying older men, men that remind them of their father or have things in common with their father. And the next stage is the latency stage. It's between the ages of 5 and 6 years to adolescence. And this is when the sexual urges kind of lie dormant. They put their sexual concerns aside. Some people theorize that it might be because of all of the traumatic thoughts and feelings and emotions that they had in the previous 3 stages. But at any rate, the reason that this is of importance for our purposes is that it's in the latency stage that we really develop defense mechanisms, according to Freud. And so some evidence socially for the latency stage might be the fact that when children are in this age, we tend to see them think that the other sex has cooties, no boys allowed, things like that. And then the genital stage should last from adolescence to death, and this is when a person's focus of libido or their pleasure center goes back on their genitals. And the major developmental goal or crisis or conflict here is to reach full sexual maturity. And if all of the stages were successfully completed, then the person should be sexually matured and mentally healthy and have a quote-unquote normal personality. So in that latency stage, we mentioned that Freud believes this is when we develop our defense mechanisms. And so defense mechanisms are unconscious strategies, and that's really important. We aren't aware that we're using these, but Freud says we all use them. So unconscious strategies that people use to reduce anxiety by concealing the source of the anxiety from themselves and from others. So rather than facing whatever thing is causing them stress or tension or anxiety, whatever thing is sending a danger signal to their ego, instead of coping with them and dealing with them, they kind of act against them by concealing what's causing the anxiety to themselves and to other people using these strategies, using these defense mechanisms, but yet they're not aware they're using them. So the first defense mechanism is repression, and this is when unacceptable or unpleasant impulses are pushed back into the unconscious so that we can't deal with them, think about them, feel the emotions associated with them. And an example of repression would be like a woman who's the victim of a sexual assault as a child but has no conscious memory of that event. However, she has maybe sexual issues that she's not sure where they're stemming from or why she has a dislike towards men or whatever the situation may be. The next defense mechanism is regression, and this is when people behave as if they were at an earlier stage of development. Maybe someone's mad at you, so they give you the silent treatment, or if you want something that you're not getting, and so you talk in baby talk to get it. These would be examples of regression. Displacement is the expression of an unwanted feeling or thought being redirected from a threatening, powerful person to a weaker one. This one's also known as kick the dog syndrome, and the classic example is that a man is talked down to and reprimanded by his boss, making him feel inferior and emasculated. So he takes all that anger that he can't direct towards his boss, because his boss could fire him. So instead of directing that anger towards the threatening source of the anger, instead he comes home from work and he kicks his dog, taking that anger out on the dog, which is a weaker person, or in this case, weaker animal. Rationalization is when people provide self-justifying explanations in place of the actual but threatening or upsetting reason for their behavior. So one of the classic examples of rationalization is when a person cheats on their significant other, and rather than admitting that what they did was wrong, they justify it to themselves by saying that the person's treating them poorly, or that they had no other choice because they weren't getting their needs met and they didn't feel loved and they needed love from someone. But when really they did have other choices, they could have broken up, they could have gone to counseling. So that's rationalization. And then denial is when people refuse to accept or acknowledge an anxiety-producing piece of information. So if you've ever seen Catfish, you've definitely seen denial. So Catfish is a show where people pretend to be someone else online, and sometimes they get people to fall in love with them and send them money, and the producers of the show, or the people on the show, will investigate the catfish and find out that they are different than who they say they are. And a lot of times the victim of the catfish scenario has a really hard time accepting that the person is not who they thought that they were. And there's all this evidence that they've been ignoring or denying for months or years that would seem obvious to the rest of us that this was not the person they thought it was, but they wanted it to be the person that they thought it was. They wanted it to be that supermodel or whoever they thought was on the other side of that computer. And even though there's a lot of evidence pointing to that it wasn't that person, they just ignored that evidence and were in a state of denial. Projection is when people attribute unwanted impulses and feelings to someone else. So often when a person is cheating on someone else in a relationship and they can't really deal with the fact that they're cheating and doing this thing that's wrong, what they will often do is accuse their partner of cheating. When there's really no reason to think that their partner is cheating, they'll just start accusing them, asking them where they're going, be checking their phone, and in reality, they're doing that because they're the ones who are cheating, and that's what they're constantly thinking about, but they can't really deal with the fact that they're doing it, so they're projecting it onto the other person and acting like that other person's doing it. Sublimation is when people divert unwanted impulses into socially approved thoughts, feelings, or behaviors. So if you're like a person that has a lot of aggression, maybe rather than going around punching people at bars or getting in fights, which is illegal, you do something that's socially acceptable, like becoming a boxer or a soldier or something where it's allowed and even rewarded for being aggressive. And then there is reaction formation, which is when unconscious impulses are expressed as their opposite in consciousness. So an example of this would be like a little boy who has a crush on a girl, but he can't really make sense of those feelings or doesn't like those feelings, so he picks on her and pulls her hair. Alright, go ahead and pause the video, head on over to Moodle, complete lecture activity number 1, and when you've finished, come back to this point in the lecture video. See you then. Okay, and now we're going to talk about a group of people called the Neo-Freudians, which were people that were followers of Freud but developed their own competing psychodynamic theories. Their theories generally place a greater emphasis on the ego and less on the id than Freud's did. So with that, there is a minimized importance of sex into the development of our personality, and they also focus more on society and culture and its influence on the developing personality. So the first Neo-Freudian that we're going to take a look at is Carl Jung. Carl Jung could be said to have looked at the primitive urges in the id a little bit more positively and with a little bit less darkness to them than Freud did. But because Jung, or Jung as it's pronounced, is more popular than many of the other Neo-Freudians we're going to talk about, we are going to watch a short documentary on Jung.
There are billions of people on the planet and many different personality types. Some people are introverted, some extroverted. Some are driven by logic, and others by their feelings. In a world of such diversity, how do we learn to relate to those who are different? And how do we learn to understand and accept who we are?
People have a desire to know themselves. People want to know, who am I? How do I function? How do I tick?
These questions were at the heart of the pioneering work of Dr. Carl Gustav Jung, a Swiss psychologist who began working at the turn of the 20th century. Despite the conformity in dress, behavior, and attitude dictated by his time, Jung championed individuality, and he invited his patients to embrace the unique person each was meant to be.
Jung said, okay, that's what society tells you, that's what's expected of you, but what do you think? How do you feel?
He said that we all need to get to know ourselves better and know our motives better. And if we could really look at that more, that we would be able to be more accepting of differences.
In his own life, Carl Jung embarked on a painful journey of self-discovery, and the lessons he learned provided inspiration for generations to come. In 1909, at the age of only 34, Carl Jung had succeeded in creating the life he'd always imagined. Born the son of a poor country minister, Jung married the wealthy Emma Rauschenbach. Together, they built an idyllic home and family. Jung had worked his way through medical school and had become a world-renowned psychologist in Zurich. And as the chosen heir apparent of pioneering psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud, Jung was at the center of a revolution taking place in the world of psychology. That revolution was based on Freud's radical concept of the unconscious. At a time when Victorian society prided itself on being highly rational and civilized, Freud argued that people were really driven by repressed urges they weren't even aware of. Jung was one of the few who had embraced Freud's provocative ideas. The pair quickly became partners in promoting psychoanalysis around the world. And slowly they were gaining the respect of the mainstream medical community. In Freud, Jung had found not only an important professional mentor, but also a father figure. His own father died when he was just 20.
The death of Carl Jung's father ended any money coming into the household. And it was up to him then. He was the only son. It was up to him to take care of both his mother and his sister.
And so keep in mind, Jung was sort of an orphan. He looked for a guide, a father, you understand, and he found that in Freud.
Jung's future seemed secure, but there was just one problem. Jung had nagging doubts about some of his mentor's theories.
For Jung, Freud was too close, too narrow. Jung was very open. He closed his eyes to nothing.
Jung spoke about Freud in a 1959 interview.
I liked him very much, but I soon discovered that when he had thought something, then it was settled, while I was doubting all along the line.
Freud's theories on the sex drive were particularly troubling to Jung. While Freud believed that sexual urges were the sole driving force behind human behavior, Jung believed that we are influenced by many other factors, like religious beliefs, the need for approval, and the drive for power.
Freud said, in effect, no, it's sex or nothing. And Jung said, I can't accept this theory wholeheartedly. And this is really what caused the rupture between them.
Things came to a head in 1913 when Jung published a book which directly contradicted Freud's theories. Unwilling to tolerate dissension in his ranks, Freud cut all ties to his former protege. Jung's mentor now became his most outspoken critic. Carl Jung was ostracized from the psychoanalytic movement he'd helped to establish.
It was a big blow to Jung. He went through a period of disorientation and a period where he wasn't really sure whether he had lost his sanity or not.
Though the separation was in the coming, it threw Jung into deep depression, which, however, was beneficial. It was liberating. He had to go on his own. The son has to do his own thing.
Ultimately, Jung would go on to do his own thing, but the years ahead would be difficult. Just months after Jung's own life had been shattered, the fabric of Victorian society was also torn apart. As World War I exploded across Europe, Jung retreated to his house on Lake Zurich to fight his own internal battle.
He went down to the beach in front of his house and played with the pebbles and sand, and he said, I don't know why I'm doing this, but this is the only thing right now that will relieve the anxiety and the disturbance that I'm feeling. From there, he went into what he calls the confrontation with the unconscious.
Desperate to find his way personally and professionally, Jung began a process of deep self-analysis. He spent hours alone recording his thoughts, analyzing his dreams, and making elaborate drawings as a way to express the deepest parts of his unconscious.
Jung used this period to think about what he was going to do with his life. He said to himself, I can't continue to practice psychoanalysis if I use Freud's terms and Freud's methods. I have to create a system of my own.
As he probed deeper and deeper into his own psyche, Jung became increasingly convinced that his unconscious was driven by more than just sexual urges, repressed thoughts, and memories. There was another influential force that Freud had overlooked: the history of civilization. Jung had studied many of the world's cultures and religions, and he observed that even the most dissimilar share common ideas and behavior patterns. He found, for example, that Native American Indians had certain stories and rituals in common with tribes in Africa and other cultures throughout the world.
And he said, these things are in common. And these people don't know anything about each other. They have no way to communicate with each other. How is it, why is it, that they are all telling a very similar, if not the exact same, version of this same story?
Jung concluded that the unconscious is influenced not only by our own experiences, but by the collective experiences of all people. These common ideas are passed down through history, religion, and culture. He called this wealth of inherited knowledge the collective unconscious. It is this collective unconscious that leads human beings around the world to adopt similar behavior patterns without even realizing it.
Every culture has certain classical, typical behavior modalities, like the hero. You can go from east to west, north to south. You can recognize a hero. You can recognize a soldier. You can recognize a healer.
Or the father as the great good figure who dispenses all knowledge and all wisdom. An unforgiving, disapproving mother.
These are universal behavior patterns. They just appear in different clothing at different times.
These behavior patterns, or archetypes as Jung called them, help us quickly and comfortably size up other people.
I'm Luke Skywalker. I'm here to rescue you.
Even at the movies, once we've identified someone as an archetypical hero, we can better predict his behavior.
When we see a movie like Star Wars, we're already right there. There's that immediate connection with the various characters in the movie. The whole idea of Darth Vader and the whole idea of archetypal evil and Luke Skywalker as the young hero, these are mythological themes. That's what attracts us to going to movies.
In the real world, many of us unconsciously play out these archetypical roles. The nurturing mother, the good son, the successful business person. But often there is a more complex, unique person inside of us that is struggling to be recognized.
Most young people today develop, I think, a pretty mature sense of how to look and act at the right times. And boy, they're quick to recognize somebody who doesn't.
Jung stressed that in order to be truly happy, we must stop trying to be who we think we should be or who everyone expects us to be, and figure out who we really are.
I think at one time or another, every girl wants to be a cheerleader. And if you're just out for the prestige, if you don't really care, the other kids spot you as a phony right away.
For years, Jung himself had played out archetypical roles. He had devoted himself to following in Freud's footsteps, all the while suppressing the inner voice that was telling him to go his own way. After his many years of soul-searching, Carl Jung had found his true self. Promoting individuality became a cornerstone of Jung's work, and with the end of World War I, a new and more open society emerged that was ready to embrace Jung's ideas. When he first published his theories in 1921, the book was an immediate international bestseller. In Psychological Types, Jung offered a system that would help people better understand different personalities and appreciate the qualities that make each of them unique. He coined terms like introvert and extrovert and explained how someone who is shy thinks differently from someone who is outgoing. Jung called this process of identifying and labeling different kinds of personalities typology.
Typology helps an awful lot of explaining the difference in functioning, and that it's okay to be different, it's okay to function differently.
For the public, finding out what personality type they were became the rage. And back in Zurich, Jung's workload exploded. At the age of 47, Carl Jung had become internationally famous, and patients from around the world were making appointments up to a year in advance with Jung.
He had more patients than he could handle. Everybody wanted something from him.
Artists and poets and writers of all sorts were attracted to him, and if they had creative blocks or they had issues with alcoholism or depression or lack of meaning, they would come to him.
But Jung's popularity didn't come without its share of negative attention. In the 1930s, the world began marching to war once again. In a divided Europe, some of Jung's theories would become increasingly controversial.
He wrote about the differences between Aryan psychology, Jewish psychology, and Chinese psychology. This was taken as Jung being anti-Semitic, but Jung said, well, look, any sensible person will see that there are differences in psychology between Jews, Aryans, and Chinese.
Jung felt that if everyone could learn to understand each other's differences, there would be less conflict in the world. But ironically, Jung's theories were adopted by the Nazis, who twisted them to suit their own agenda. Jung sparked controversy in 1933 when he agreed to take over as head of an international society for psychotherapy. At the time, most of the group's members worked in Germany and were facing Nazi domination. Jung wrote that he wanted to help his German colleagues keep their relatively new profession alive, despite the suppression. But some viewed Jung's efforts as collaboration.
At the time, Germany was the predominant country in Europe before World War II. Everything science, philosophy. So Jung felt it was very important to maintain psychotherapy in Germany if at all possible. So he worked with the Nazis from 1933 to 1940, and people have not forgiven him for doing that.
Over the years, Jung vehemently denied being an anti-Semite and supporting the Nazis, but controversy remains. Toward the end of his life, Jung turned away from treating individual patients, traveling, and lecturing. A true introvert at heart, he spent increasing amounts of time at home on Lake Zurich, surrounded by his family. When his supporters began urging Jung to start an institute that would teach and spread his theories, Jung only reluctantly agreed.
He had an allergy against following. He didn't want you to follow a guru. He didn't even want you to follow, Christ. He didn't want to follow. He wanted you to become an individual. So he didn't want people to follow him. But he realized people wanted to learn and study, his ideas and his thoughts, and he had no choice.
Eventually, societies bearing Jung's name sprang up from San Francisco and Kiev to Singapore and Argentina. Jung himself spent his final years writing and enjoying a simple life. He died at his home in 1961. He was 85 years old. Despite his wishes, a definite cult of personality developed around Carl Jung after his death. With the age of flower power and hippies came a whole new generation that was captivated by Jung's message, which included terms like Age of Aquarius and New Age.
The New Age, he meant, in the most basic terms, after the end of the Second World War, new ways of thinking, new possibilities for society. He felt that politics was evolving, that the relationship between men and women was evolving. He had a sense that everything was going to change and change profoundly.
More recently, Jung's original work with personality types led to perhaps his most enduring and practical legacy, the Myers-Briggs test. This tool helps schools offer career guidance, and it enables corporate America to better match an employee to a specific job.
It took American pragmatism to basically put his theory into a test, the Myers-Briggs typology test. And it's the most used test in the United States. Every year, more than 1 million people take that test to find out, how do I function?
Carl Jung was ahead of his time in many ways. Today, decades after his death, his once revolutionary theories are now part of the fabric of our culture.
Jung has maintained and increased his popularity because he speaks to the kinds of issues in terms of meaning, in terms of spirituality that people are looking for.
We are a society that values the individual more readily than ever before, and terms like introvert and extrovert are a part of everyone's vocabulary. In this way, Carl Jung himself has become part of our collective unconscious.
So Carl Jung talked a lot about his idea of the collective unconscious, which are memories, ideas, thoughts, feelings, images, symbols that are shared by all members of the human species. And he says that we inherit these ideas, thoughts, components, contents of our collective unconscious from our ancestors, maybe even animal ancestors, and the whole human race. So one of the main things in the collective unconscious are called archetypes. And archetypes are universal symbolic representations of a particular person, object, or experience that are something we all share, regardless of our culture or of our religion or of where we grew up. These archetypes seem to be kind of programmed in the collective unconscious of the human, according to Jung. So some examples of archetypes are the hero, the villain, the class clown, the hippie, the good, the evil, all of these things. When I say them to you, you can kind of conjure up an image in your mind, and that image is very similar to what we all picture. And so what we all picture is our collective unconscious, and the image itself would be the archetype. So Jung did agree with Freud that the unconscious is a very powerful determinant in our personality. He just de-emphasized the importance of sex in childhood and the development of our personality, and he also really wanted to introduce some ideas about community and culture, and especially the collective unconscious and archetypes, and what it means to be human, and how these things that Freud didn't mention, collective unconscious, culture, society, archetypes, do play a role in our behavior, in the person that we want to be, in the person we think we are, and in how we act. Another Neo-Freudian was Alfred Adler, and he said that the primary human motivation, what really develops our personality, is superiority in self. He said that we all have an urge towards self-improvement and perfection, not sexual urges. And these are the urges, the self-improvement and perfection urges, that really act as determinants of our personality. And one thing in particular that he said was very important in the forming of our personality was whether or not we had what he called an inferiority complex. And so this is a problem affecting adults who have not been able to overcome the feelings of inferiority that they develop as children. So we all develop feelings of inferiority, according to Adler, when we are children, due to the fact that we are small and limited in our knowledge about the world. However, if we have healthy parent-child relationships, then we are able to outgrow this inferiority complex. However, if we're not able to outgrow this inferiority complex, then we develop a defense mechanism that Adler called compensation. And this is when people try to overcome the feelings of inferiority in one area of life by striving to be superior in another area of life. So, for example, if you have ever heard of the Napoleon complex, the idea is that he felt inferior about his height, so that's why he was very aggressive and dominating and would take over countries and do all of these things because he felt inferior in one area as it related to his height, so he would try to act superior in other areas. Adler also discussed a birth order theory. There are other birth order theories out there, but this is Adler's. He says that firstborn children come into the world, they get all the attention, and then their younger siblings, the ones that come after them, end up stealing their attention. So they overcompensate throughout life for this lack of attention. They try to get back that attention they once had, and they try to do this by becoming overachievers. He says that middle children generally feel superior over the dethroned oldest child, and they dominate over younger siblings. So as adults, they become competitive, where they'll be able to continue showing their domination. And then finally, there are the youngest children who are pampered and overprotected as babies, and since they don't get the same freedom as their older siblings, they are most likely to develop the inferiority complex and then do the compensation in large part of their personality. The next Neo-Freudian is Karen Horney, and she really introduced a lot of women's issues in psychology, and particularly in personality development. So she was really popular during the 1930s and the 1940s, and that's when she started introducing the idea of considering social and cultural context in personality theories. So she argued that women didn't actually have penis envy, but instead they envied kind of what the penis represented, a man's independence, success, and freedom, which is something that back in the 1930s and 40s was not available to women in the same way it was available to men. So, in response to penis envy, she developed what she called womb envy and said that men feel the need to compensate for not being able to have children by striving for success in other areas, which is why work is so important to them. She argues that this might be why some men belittle women. It's like they are acting as if they don't care that women can carry babies when they can't. And so they put them down as a way to make themselves feel better, sort of like that compensation that Adler was talking about. And ultimately, what Horney thought was a determinant in the development of personality had to do with basic anxiety. So she defined basic anxiety as anxiety created when a child is born into the bigger and more powerful world of older people and adults. And she says children overcome this when parents show them love, security, and affection. But children that don't overcome this basic anxiety develop neurotic personalities and maladaptive relationships. So she said that when this happens, children try to deal with this anxiety by moving toward people, and this causes them to develop clingy and needy personalities. They might try to deal with this unresolved anxiety by moving against people, in which they develop aggressive, demanding, and cruel personalities, or they might try to deal with this unresolved basic anxiety by moving away from people, developing withdrawn personalities. Okay, the humanistic approach includes ideas from Abraham Maslow and his hierarchy of needs, which we've talked a lot about, so I'm not going to revisit that here. But instead, we're going to look at another important figure in the humanistic perspective, Carl Rogers. And so, Carl Rogers says that it is our need for self-actualization and positive regard that ultimately shapes our personality. So he says that the main motivating factor in the development of our personality is what he called the self-actualizing tendency. And of course, self-actualization is obviously a very important component of Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs theory as well. So Rogers said that we all have a self-concept, which is the image of ourselves that develops from interactions with important, significant people in our life, our parents, our coworkers, partners, siblings, friends. And some elements of that self-concept are the real self and the ideal self. And the real self is one's perceptions of their actual characteristics, traits, and abilities, whereas the ideal self is your perceptions of who you think you should be or who you would like to be. So the closer our real self is to our ideal self, the less anxiety we have. And so a distorted view of our real self, like a lack of self-awareness or an unattainable ideal self, having expectations that are unrealistic of yourself, these two things can be the main sources of this mismatch between our ideal and real self. So if we can get these two things to overlap, the real self and the ideal self, if we can get them to be congruent, then we are more likely to be able to self-actualize or be the best versions of ourselves. And Rogers says that what we need to self-actualize is positive regard, which is the warmth, affection, love, and respect that comes from having significant others in your life. And we have the need for positive regard because we all have a desire to be loved and respected by others. The problem with positive regard is that if we become too reliant on it, we can begin to see and judge ourselves through the eyes of others. And this can cause us to become preoccupied with what others think of us, and that's not necessarily good for our own self-esteem and self-worth, because maybe what other people think of us is inaccurate, and we need to really be able to rely on our own valuations of ourselves in order to feel confidence and self-assured. So then what's best for us in the development of our personality is unconditional positive regard, which is an attitude of acceptance and respect on the part of the observer, no matter what you say or do. And so Rogers argues that you can achieve unconditional positive regard through real friends, trusted family members, therapists, And he argues that when we as people are shown unconditional positive regard, that this allows us to grow and develop more realistic self-concepts of ourselves, and then we're more likely to become fully functioning or to become self-actualized. So some of the main tenets of unconditional positive regard are empathy, and we feel that empathy from other people by their ability to listen to us without judgment. So this is something that could be kind of a sign that you're receiving unconditional positive regard from someone, is if you feel like they listen to you empathetically without judgment. Whether they agree with you or not doesn't matter. It's the idea that they are putting themselves in your shoes, trying to see the world from your perspective, and truly hearing what you're saying. And just this listening can cause people to lean towards self-actualization or work towards becoming fully functioning. And Roger says a fully functioning person is a person who is in touch with and trusting of their deepest, innermost urges and feelings. They experience a match between their real and ideal self, and that a fully functioning person is in the process of self-actualizing or being the best version of themselves, reaching their full potential. Okay, and that leads us to trait theory. And trait theory is theories that endeavor to describe the characteristics that make up human personality in an effort to predict a person's future behavior. So a trait is defined as a consistent, enduring way of thinking, feeling, or behaving. So there are a lot of different personality traits out there. In fact, a psychologist by the name of Alpert was able to find 18,000 traits to define personality. And ultimately, using a statistical procedure called factor analysis, he was able to narrow them down to 200. And one of the ways that he did this was by giving a questionnaire asking a person to mark words that describe them and then look for patterns between people. So, for example, if it said talkative, fun-loving, social, that would all be under the category of extroverted. And so that's how he was able to whittle his 18,000 words down to 200 words to describe or define personality traits. However, now, one of the most common measures of personality is called the Big Five, or the five-factor model, and it can be remembered by the acronym OCEAN. So the idea is that these 5 personality traits comprise personality in total, and that people will fall somewhere along a continuum in correspondence or in conjunction with each of these personality traits. So the first one is openness to experience, and then the other end of the continuum would be closed-mindedness. And a person who is open to experience has a toleration for and exploration of the unfamiliar. They'll consider ideas that are converse to theirs. They're not upset when they are questioned for their beliefs or challenged. In fact, they're willing to consider alternative points of view. The next personality trait is conscientiousness, and this is the degree to which a person is organized, persistent, and motivated in goal-directed behavior. So the other end of the continuum for conscientiousness might be carelessness, a person who is late, disorganized, not necessarily goal-oriented, might have a lot of things going on at once rather than kind of focusing on one thing at a time. And the next one is extroversion. So the opposite end of the continuum for extroversion is introversion. And so extroversion and introversion are often misunderstood. What they refer to is your required level of social interaction. So an extrovert is really energized and fueled by interacting socially, where for an introvert it's exhausting. It doesn't necessarily mean that an introvert is shy or not good at being social. It just is a preference to have more alone time than an extrovert needs. And the next of the big 5 personality traits is agreeableness. The other end of the continuum would be disagreeableness. And so this is really your orientation along the continuum from compassion to antagonism in your thoughts, feelings, and actions. So a person that's agreeable is sometimes referred to as a people pleaser or a yes man, whereas a person who is disagreeable might be the devil's advocate or the person who likes to push others' buttons for fun. And the last trait in the 5-factor model is neuroticism, and this is a person's proneness to psychological distress, excessive cravings or urges, and unrealistic ideas. So at the other end of the continuum would be a person who is calm and even-tempered, not easily frazzled, someone who is confident and self-assured and stable. Alright, go ahead and pause the video, head on over to Moodle, complete lecture activity number 2, and when you've finished, come back to this point in the lecture. See you then. The next 2 approaches to understanding personality development are behaviorist and social cognitive approaches. So the behaviorist approach would say that we learn our personalities based on stimulus-response pairings or classical conditioning. Or even operant conditioning. We do this and then this happens. And so how would a behaviorist say we develop a shy personality? Probably they would say that we were punished for speaking, and so avoiding speaking becomes a negative reinforcer. If we don't speak, we don't get punished, and so the removal of the opportunity for punishment acts as a negative reinforcer. And again, remember, punishment doesn't have to be being grounded or spanking, but just being mocked or ignored could be a punishment. So this social cognitive view of behavior that makes up personality is governed by this stimulus response pattern, as well as the cognitive processes such as anticipating, judging, memory, and observational learning. So Albert Bandura is really kind of the leading psychologist of the social cognitive view, historically speaking, and he developed what he calls reciprocal determination, which is an explanation of how the factors of our environment, our personal characteristics, and our behavior can interact to determine future behavior. So these 3 factors affect each other in a kind of give and take relationship, and ultimately they determine the behavior that will make up our personalities. He says that past reinforcements are part of the cognitive process. For example, if you grow up in a loud house, that would represent your environment, and you're born with a hyper temperament, that would be a personal characteristic, then you're likely to talk a lot, and this is going to be a behavior. So he mentions the importance of self-efficacy, which is an individual's expectancy of how effective their efforts to accomplish a goal will be in any particular circumstance. And this is different than self-esteem, which is our value of our self-worth, where self-efficacy is developed by success or failure in the past. It's developed by what people tell us about our competence and our own assessment of our abilities. So self-efficacy is directly related to if we think we can accomplish goals or not. Okay, let's listen to Bandura talk about his theory.
Humans are wonderfully adaptive and creative. In this program, we're discussing the social cognitive theory of human behavior. Now, a comprehensive theory must explain how people acquire competencies, values, and styles of behavior, but it must also explain how people motivate and regulate their behavior. We'll examine some of the basic premises and applications of social cognitive theory in this program. Brief encounters with the feared activity gradually become longer
and the client becomes bolder. It took this person just 5 one-hour sessions to overcome her severe phobia. Now this is a powerful treatment. If people are persuaded they have what it takes to succeed, they exert more effort and avoid focusing on their doubts when problems arise. And one's behavior can also change one's personal characteristics, as when we use performance feedback to improve our skills. For instance, people will cross the street against a red light if a well-dressed person with an attaché case does it first, but not if the same person is dressed in shabby clothes. Chance favors the inquisitive, the venturesome, who go places, do things, and explore new activities. My initial research and observational learning centered on the social modeling of aggression. In our experiment, preschool children observed an adult model beat up an inflated Bobo doll in novel ways. Now, the children who had observed the aggressive modeling adopted much of it. In long-running drama serials, are now being used to reduce some of the most urgent global problems, such as burgeoning population growth.
Creo que estoy embarazada otra vez.
Through selective disengagement of moral self-sanctions, people who otherwise behave considerately can do extremely cruel things. Marked cultural changes challenge the view that people are innately aggressive. People are now changing the genetic makeup of plants and animals, and even toying with the prospects of shaping some aspects of their own nature. The challenge is how to enable and motivate people to use these capabilities for personal and social betterment.
Julian Rotter was another social cognitive psychologist, and he developed Rotter's social learning theory, which viewed personality as a relatively stable set of potential responses to various situations. And he said that we develop patterns of responding based on past reinforcement, so what we've been rewarded for. These patterns make up our personality. And he said another thing that's a large determinant in our personality is our locus of control. And so people can have either an internal or external locus of control. A person that has an internal locus of control feels power over their outcomes in their life and their abilities to make change, whereas people with an external locus of control often are left feeling helpless and vulnerable, and that things are happening to them and they lack the ability to make any changes in their life. And obviously, Rotter argues that your locus of control plays a large part in the different personality traits that you take on and display. Biological and evolutionary approaches to understanding personality are theories that suggest that important components of personality are actually inherited. They're genetic, they're in our DNA. So traits that lead to survival and reproductive success are passed on. And some research that supports these theories are twin studies and adoption studies. So twin studies are when identical twins are raised in different environments but end up having very similar personalities, which shows that your personality is not a outcome of your environment, but instead is an outcome of your biological composition. And then there are adoption studies that show adopted children have personalities closer to their biological parents and siblings than their adopted parents and siblings. Again, leaning towards the side of the nurture rather than nature argument. So let's watch this video on personality and twin studies.
The sun's shining, the birds are singing, and it's Karen White's favourite part of the day. Time for a cup of coffee and a chat with her neighbour and best friend.
Do you want to come round? I've got that Black Adder video.
All right then, only if you've got coffee and biscuits.
Shall we say 5 minutes?
All right then.
Lynn is Karen's identical twin. They've been inseparable since they were born. They went to the same school, have always lived in the same town, and on occasion had the same boyfriend.
We went out on New Year's Eve, and I ended up kissing Mark on the stroke of midnight, and I didn't like the way he kissed me, so I bit his tongue or his lip, I think, and said, "Oh, you know," and Lynn ended up marrying him.
Because after New Year's Eve, when he got back to her, I don't know why, the funny thing is I started talking to him, so he thought that it was me that he kissed. And he thought, oh, she's had a change of heart and whatever. And we just started being friendly. And then he realised that it was Karen he'd kissed, but it was me that he actually wanted to go out with, isn't it? So it was really strange.
As well as sometimes fancying the same blokes, they have the same taste in clothes and have the same sense of humour.
Because I won't ever shoot myself. No, shame.
As identical twins, Karen and Lynn have exactly the same set of genes. They're clones, and they've also had the same upbringing. The question is how much their personality traits are determined by their genes. The view was that genes played little, if any, role in shaping our personalities. How could something as complex as the human psyche be explained away by a few strands of DNA? Well, it turns out that it can. This DNA analysis is painting a new and astonishing picture of the role that genes play in influencing our behaviour.
It's almost unbelievable, the results, because they suggest that genetics is important almost across the board. You can find some traits, surprisingly like shyness, for example, that show somewhat more genetic influence than other traits. For example, femininity. But the more striking thing is that no one has demonstrated any personality trait to show no genetic influence.
Psychological studies of twins raised apart have shown that behaviour such as addiction and criminality have a genetic basis. But these have been debunked, partly because many top scientists don't take psychology seriously, but also, some say, because of political correctness. To even hint that people are born bad or born clever could be seen as running counter to a century of social reform. But in the coming years, our comfortable views of human nature may have to be changed.
The Human Genome Project has been completed in terms of sequencing the human genome, and there's going to be a lot of research over the next few years in trying to understand what those different kind of genes do. And some of those genes, of course, will not be involved in disease-related conditions. They'll be involved in human characteristics in which we all have some kind of experience, whether it's to do with fear or anxiety, sexual orientation. And so I think there'll be a lot of interest from the public and from the media in this kind of research as it unfolds. And we need to think about how that research is going to be applied and whether it should be, the results should be applied.
One of those research programmes is into depression. Norma, her sister Margaret and niece Vanessa have all suffered.
For me, it feels as if I'm cut off from the rest of the world. It's like having a glass shield in front of you. You can see what's going on, but you're not part of it. It just built up to the feeling I just couldn't go on anymore. And I took a few days off, and that few days has gone into 10 years.
Their parents and children have also suffered. In all, 10 members of their family have been affected. Genes are obviously a factor.
Does the depression feel worse at any particular time of the day?
First thing in the morning.
Researchers from the Institute of Psychiatry are trying to track down some of the genes involved. They scour the country looking for suitable families. They first diagnose the condition, and later samples of the patient's blood are sent off for analysis.
if it was something that was found to be a genetic problem, it would just make it a lot easier to deal with. Perhaps the blame would go away.
The women's DNA is stored in a freezer, along with samples from other depressed people. Computers can now rapidly read the genetic code of each patient and compare it with that of non-depressed people. If there's a difference between the two, then genes are probably involved.
Makes us a little worried because
these men are the world's foremost scientists in behavioral genetics. As well as studying depression, they're homing in on genes influencing intelligence, addiction, and even antisocial behavior.
so in some ways I was wondering, you're thinking even that these sorts of differences are real.
And if the research all comes off, it could help to identify those likely to develop problems when they're children, and then take preventative steps.
It does raise the question as to whether antisocial behaviour should be regarded, like depression or schizophrenia, as a disease. And there are those that believe that it should, but in a sense, I suppose the main issue is whether it has a partly biological basis, and as I said, I think there is evidence that it does. So the real question is, in the long term, would one be able to use genetic evidence to, for example, make medication that alters antisocial behaviour? And again, that's a possibility.
And if you could intervene before the problems become problems, I think it's likely to be much more effective, even from a cost point of view, but especially from the child's lives. You don't wait for problems to happen before you do anything about them, because we aren't that good at dealing with problems once they're full-blown.
Mick McDade wishes someone had spotted his problem early. He used to be an alcoholic, but he's fine now and able to visit a fun fair with his doctor, David Ball, who's trying to track down the genes that help drive Mick to drink.
If we can find the genes involved, then we can understand the biology of what's going on when people are either vulnerable to becoming alcohol dependent or what happens when they become alcohol dependent. Now, if we can understand the biology, then we can develop better treatments to work on that biology. It may also be possible, on the basis of a genetic test, to identify those individuals which may respond to that particular form of treatment or may respond to a different form of treatment, which may even be psychological.
Dr. Ball thinks the same set of genes are involved in other types of addiction. He and other researchers suspect that some people are driven to drink or drugs because of a chemical imbalance in their brain that can only be compensated by intense stimulation. And controversially, they believe that ordinary thrill seekers like these are driven to search out excitement and adventure because of their genes.
So now that you've heard all the theories on how we develop our personality, the next question should be, well, how do we assess a personality? So let's talk about personality testing. There are a wide variety of different methods, but we're going to go over some of the most popular or most well-known. So the first is personality inventories, and these are paper and pencil or computerized tests that consist of statements that require a specific standardized response from the person taking the test. So the Myers-Briggs test instrument with those 4 letters that you get, and the Minnesota Multifaceted Personality Inventory, also known as the MMPI, are some of the most popular personality inventories, and of course the Big 5 personality inventory. And personality inventories are used in selection a lot for jobs, cops, astronauts, salespeople, and then also if you're interested in, like, what should I be as my job or as my career, there are personality tests that are useful in determining what career best fits your personality. I actually took one in college, and it said that I should be a flight attendant, which I agree with. I think I would love to be a flight attendant. I get to travel and talk to people and, like, give them things, peanuts, pretzels. That's right in my wheelhouse. I like it. There's also projective personality tests, which are personality assessments that present ambiguous visual stimuli to a client or a person and then ask that person to respond with whatever comes to mind. So this guy, Henry Murray, created a thematic apperception test where he gave people pictures that you see here on the screen, And then he would ask the person to tell a story, and a psychoanalyst would interpret the story that they told under the assumption that it provides clues into their unconscious and who they really are. The projective personality test that's the most well known is the Rorschach test, and this is when you give people ink blots, which are more ambiguous pictures, and then you ask them to describe what they see, and again, a psychoanalyst scores their responses on a number of key factors that they're looking for to determine their personality. There are behavioral assessments, which are when behaviorists want to observe a person in a natural setting, since they believe that personality is a result of stimuli-response patterns in our environment. And so they conduct direct observations, which are assessments where they watch a person engage in ordinary day-to-day behavior in an effort to assess their personality. And then another method of personality assessment is like a clinical interview, which is a method of personality assessment in which a professional asks questions of a client or a person and allows them to answer. Okay, let's watch this quick video on personality assessment.
How would you describe your personality? Maybe friendly, creative, quirky? What about nervous or timid or outgoing? But has anyone ever called you a sanguine? What about a kapha or full of metal? Ancient Greek physician Hippocrates believed personality manifested itself in 4 different humors, and basically you are who you are because of your balance of phlegm blood and yellow and black bile. According to traditional Chinese medicine, our personalities depend on the balance of 5 elements: earth, wind, water, metal, and fire. Those who practice traditional Hindu Ayurvedic medicine view each other as unique combinations of 3 different mind-body principles called doshas. But Sigmund Freud thought our personalities depended in part on who was winning the battle of urges between the id, ego, and superego. Meanwhile, humanistic psychologist Abraham Maslow suggested that the key to self-actualization was first successfully climbing a hierarchy of more basic needs. And then you got your BuzzFeed quizzes to determine what kind of pirate or font or sandwich or Harry Potter character you are, but I wouldn't ever take one of those seriously. All this is to say that people have been characterizing one another for a long time, and whether you're into blood or bile or ego or id or BLT or PB&J, there are a lot of ways to describe and measure a personality. And all these theories, all the years of research and cigar smoking and inkblot gazing and the fans debating whether they're more of a Luke or a Leia, they're all funneling down to one big central question. Who or what is the self? Last week we talked about how psychologists often study personality by examining the differences between characteristics, and by looking at how these various characteristics combine to create a whole thinking, feeling person. The early psychoanalytic and humanistic theorists had a lot of ideas about personality, but some psychologists questioned their lack of clearly measurable standards, like if there was no way to really quantify someone's inkblot response or how orally fixated they might be. So this drive to find a more empirical approach spawned 2 more popular theories in the 20th century, known as the trait and social cognitive perspectives. Instead of focusing on things like lingering unconscious influences or missed growth opportunities, trait theory researchers look to define personality through stable and lasting behavior patterns and conscious motivations. Legend has it that it all began in 1919 when young American psychologist Gordon Allport paid a visit to none other than Freud himself. Allport was telling Freud about his journey there on the train and how there was this little boy who was obsessed with staying clean and didn't want to sit next to anyone or touch anything. Allport wondered if the boy's mother had a kind of dirt phobia that had rubbed off on him. So yada yada yada, he's telling his tale, and at the end of it, Freud looks at him and says, "Was that little boy you?" Allport was basically like, "No, man, that was just some kid on the train. Don't try to make this into some big unconscious episode from my repressed childhood." Allport thought Freud was digging a little too deep, and that sometimes you just need to look at motives in the present, not the past, to describe behavior. So Allport started his own club, describing personality in terms of fundamental traits, or characteristic behaviors and conscious motives. He wasn't so much interested in explaining traits as he was in describing them. Modern trait researchers like Robert McCrae and Paul Costa have since organized our fundamental characteristics into what's casually known as the Big Five: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, which you can remember using the mnemonic ocean or canoe, which whichever one you prefer. Each of these traits exists on a spectrum, so for example, your level of openness can range on one end from being totally open to new things and variety, or wanting strict, regular routine on the other end. Your degree of conscientiousness can translate into being impulsive and careless, or careful and disciplined. Someone high on the extroversion end will be sociable, while those on the low end will be shy and reserved. A very agreeable person, meanwhile, is helpful and trusting, while someone at the opposite end may be suspicious or uncooperative. And finally, on the neuroticism spectrum, an emotionally stable person will be more calm and secure, while a less stable person is often anxious, insecure, and self-pitying. The important idea here is that these traits are hypothesized to predict behavior and attitude. Like an introvert might prefer communicating through email more than an extrovert, and an agreeable person is much more likely to help their neighbor move that couch than a suspicious one who's just glaring through the window. By adulthood, trait theorists will tell you these characteristics are pretty stable, but that isn't to say that they can't flex a little in different situations. Like that same shy person might end up singing Elvis karaoke in a room full of people under the right conditions. So our personality traits are better at predicting our average behavior than what we'd do in any specific situation, and research indicates that some traits, like neuroticism, seem to be better predictors of behavior than others. This flexibility that we all seem to have leads to the fourth major theory on personality, the social cognitive perspective. Originally proposed by our bobo-beating friend Alfred Bandura, the social cognitive school emphasizes the interaction between our traits and their social context. Bandura noted that we learn a lot of our behavior by watching and imitating others. That's the social part of the equation. But we also think a lot about how these social interactions affect our behavior, which is the cognitive part. So in this way, people and their situations basically work together to create behavior. Bandura referred to this sort of interplay as reciprocal determinism, meaning that, for example, the kind of books you read or music you listen to or friends you hang out with say something about your personality because different people choose to be in different environments. And then those environments, in turn, continue to reinforce our personalities. So if Bernice has a kind of anxious, suspicious personality, and she has a serious Titanic crush on Sherlock Holmes, she might be extra attuned to potentially dangerous or fishy situations. But the more she sees the world in that way, the more anxious and suspicious she gets. In this way, we're both the creators and the products of the situations we surround ourselves with. That's why one of the key indicators of personality in this school of thought has to do with our sense of personal control. That is, the extent to which you perceive that you have control over your environment. Someone who believes that they control their own fate or make their own luck is said to have an internal locus of control, while those who feel like they're just guided by forces beyond their control are said to have an external locus. Now, whether we're talking about control versus helplessness, introversion versus extroversion, calm versus anxious, or whatever, each of these different personality perspectives have their own methods of testing and measuring personality. We've talked before about how the psychoanalyst superhunk Herman Rorschach used his ink blot test to infer information about a person's personality. We know that Freud used dream analysis, and both he and Jung were fans of free association. The broader school of theorists, now known as the psychodynamic camp that descended from Freud and pals, also use other projective psychological tests, including the famous thematic apperception test. In this kind of test, you'd be presented with evocative but ambiguous pictures and then asked to provide information about them. You might be asked to tell a story about the scenes, considering things like how are the characters feeling, or what's going on, or what happened before this event and what will happen after. Like, check it out, is the woman crying because her brother just died or from a bee sting? Or is she a maid laughing because some royal just passed out drunk in his bed? Or perhaps the object of her long-burning affection has just confessed his love in a fever haze, all Jane Austen style, and she's having a mini breakdown in the hall. The idea is that your responses will reveal something about your concerns and motivations in real life, or how you see the world, or about your unconscious processes that drive you. By contrast with that approach, though, modern trait personality researchers believe that you can assess personality traits by having people answer a series of test questions. There are lots of so-called personality trait inventories out there. Some provide a quick reading on a particular enduring trait like anxiety or self-esteem, while others gauge a wide range of traits like our friends the Big Five. These tests, like the Myers-Briggs, which you might have heard of, involve long questionnaires of true-false or agree-disagree questions like, do you enjoy being the center of attention? Do you find it easy to empathize with others? Or do you value justice over mercy? But the classic Minnesota multiphasic personality inventory is probably the most widely used personality test. The most recent version asks a series of 567 true-false questions, varying from no one seems to understand me, to I like mechanics magazines, to I loved my father, and is often used to identify emotional disorders. Then there's how Bandura's social cognitive camp sizes you up. Because this school of thought emphasizes the the interaction of environment and behavior rather than just traits alone, they aren't solely into questions and answers. Instead, they might measure personality in different contexts, understanding behavior in one situation is best predicted by how you acted in a similar situation. Like if Bernice freaked out and tried to hide under the bed during the last 5 thunderstorms, we can predict that she will do that again next time. And if we conducted a controlled lab experiment where, say, we looked at the effects of thunderstorm noises on people's behavior, we might get an even better sense of what baseline psychological factors could best predict storm-induced freakouts. And finally, there are the humanistic theorists like Maslow. They often reject standardized assessments altogether. Instead, they tend to measure your self-concept through therapy, interviews, and questionnaires that ask subjects to describe both how they would ideally like to be and how they actually are. The idea is that the closer the actual and ideal are, the more positive the subject's sense of self. Which brings us back to that biggest motherlode question of them all. Who or what is the self? All the books out there about self-esteem, self-help, self-awareness, self-control, and so on are built upon one assumption, that the self is the organizer of our thoughts and feelings and actions, essentially the center of a personality. But, of course, it's a sticky issue. One way to think about self is through the concept of possible selves, like your ideal self, perhaps devastatingly attractive and intelligent, successful and well-loved, as well as your most feared self, the one who could end up unemployed and lonely and run down. This balance of potential best and worst selves motivates us through life. In the end, once you factor in environment and childhood experiences, culture, and all that mess, not to mention biology, which we haven't even touched on today, can we really firmly define self, or answer certainly that we even have one? That, my friend, is one of life's biggest questions, and so far it has yet to be universally answered. But you learned a lot anyway today, right? As we talked about the trait and social cognitive perspectives, and also about different ways these schools and others measure and test personality. We also talked about what self is and how our self-esteem works. Thanks for watching, especially to our Subbable subscribers who make Crash Course possible. To find out how you can become a supporter, just go to subbable.com/crashcourse. This episode was written by Kathleen Yale, edited by Blake DePestino, and our consultant is Dr. Ranjit Bhagwat. Our director and editor is Nicholas Jenkins, and the script supervisor is Michael Aranda, who is also our sound designer, and the graphics team is Thought Cafe.
The sun's shining, the birds are singing, and it's Karen White's favourite part of the day. Time for a cup of coffee and a chat with her neighbour and best friend.
Do you want to come round? I've got that Black Adder video.
All right then. Only if you've got coffee and biscuits. Shall we say 5 minutes? All right then.
Lynn is Karen's identical twin. They've been inseparable since they were born. They went to the same school, have always lived in the same town, and on occasion had the same boyfriend.
We went out on New Year's Eve, and I ended up kissing Mark on the stroke of midnight, and I didn't like the way he kissed me, so I bit his tongue and his lip, I think, and said, "Oh, you know," and Lynn ended up marrying him.
Because after New Year's Eve, when he got back to her, I don't know why, the funny thing is I started talking to him, so he thought that it was me that he kissed. And he thought, oh, she's had a change of heart and whatever. And we just started being friendly. And then he realised that it was Karen he'd kissed, but it was me that he actually wanted to go out with, isn't it? So it was really strange.
As well as sometimes fancying the same blokes, they have the same taste in clothes and have the same sense of humour.
Because I won't ever shoot myself.
No, shame.
As identical twins, Karen and Lynn have exactly the same set of genes. They're clones, and they've also had the same upbringing. The question is how much their personality traits are determined by their genes. The view was that genes played little, if any, role in shaping our personalities. How could something as complex as the human psyche be explained away by a few strands of DNA? Well, it turns out that it can. This DNA analysis is painting a new and astonishing picture of the role that genes play in influencing our behaviour.
It's almost unbelievable, the results, because they suggest that genetics is important almost across the board. You can find some traits, surprisingly like shyness, for example, that show somewhat more genetic influence than other traits, for example, femininity. But the more striking thing is that no one has demonstrated any personality trait to show no genetic influence.
Psychological studies of twins raised apart have shown that behaviour such as addiction and criminality have a genetic basis. But these have been debunked, partly because many top scientists don't take psychology seriously, but also, some say, because of political correctness. To even hint that people are born bad or born clever could be seen as running counter to a century of social reform. But in the coming years, our comfortable views of human nature may have to be changed.
The Human Genome Project has been completed in terms of sequencing the human genome, and there's going to be a lot of research over the next few years in trying to understand what those different kind of genes do. And some of those genes, of course, will not be involved in disease-related conditions. They'll be involved in human characteristics in which we all have some kind of experience, whether it's to do with fear or anxiety, sexual orientation. And so I think there'll be a lot of interest from the public and from the media in this kind of research as it unfolds. And we need to think about how that research is going to be applied and whether the results should be applied.
One of those research programmes is into depression. Norma, her sister Margaret and niece Vanessa have all suffered.
For me, it feels as if I'm cut off from the rest of the world. It's like having a glass shield in front of you. You can see what's going on, but you're not part of it. It just built up to the feeling I just couldn't go on anymore. And I took a few days off, and that few days has gone into 10 years.
Their parents and children have also suffered. In all, 10 members of their family have been affected. Genes are obviously a factor.
Does the depression feel worse at any particular time of the day?
First thing in the morning.
Researchers from the Institute of Psychiatry are trying to track down some of the genes involved. They scour the country looking for suitable families. They first diagnose the condition, and later samples of the patient's blood are sent off for analysis.
If it was something that was found to be a genetic problem, it would just make it a lot easier to deal with. Perhaps the blame would go away.
The women's DNA is stored in a freezer, along with samples from other depressed people. Computers can now rapidly read the genetic code of each patient and compare it with that of non-depressed people. If there's a difference between the two, then genes are probably involved.
Makes us a little worried because
these men are the world's foremost scientists in behavioural genetics. As well as studying depression, they're homing in on genes influencing intelligence, addiction, and even antisocial behaviour.
so in some ways I was wondering, you're thinking even that these sorts of differences are real.
And if the research all comes off, it could help to identify those likely to develop problems when they're children, and then take preventative steps.
It does raise the question as to whether antisocial behaviour should be regarded, like depression or schizophrenia, as a disease. And there are those that believe that it should, but in a sense, I suppose the main issue is whether it has a partly biological basis, and as I said, I think there is evidence that it does. So the real question is, in the long term, would one be able to use genetic evidence to, for example, make medication that alters antisocial behaviour? And again, that's a possibility.
And if you could intervene before the problems become problems, I think it's likely to be much more effective, even from a cost point of view, but especially from the child's lives. You don't wait for problems to happen before you do anything about them, because we aren't that good at dealing with problems once they're full-blown.
Mick McDade wishes someone had spotted his problem early. He used to be an alcoholic, but he's fine now and able to visit a fun fair with his doctor, David Ball, who's trying to track down the genes that help drive Mick to drink.
If we can find the genes involved, then we can understand the biology of what's going on when people are either vulnerable to becoming alcohol dependent or what happens when they become alcohol dependent. Now, if we can understand the biology, then we can develop better treatments to work on that biology. It may also be possible, on the basis of a genetic test, to identify those individuals which may respond to that particular form of treatment or may respond to a different form of treatment, which may even be psychological.
Dr. Ball thinks the same set of genes are involved in other types of addiction. He and other researchers suspect that some people are driven to drink or drugs because of a chemical imbalance in their brain that can only be compensated by intense stimulation. And controversially, they believe that ordinary thrill seekers like these are driven to search out excitement and adventure because of their genes.
Okay, that's it for the lecture on personality. So head on over to Moodle to complete the last lecture activity and also to do your forum posts. And we shall see you on the next lecture.